Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Tracy Hunt from Newcastle, Wyoming. Tracy has ranched for many years, and he has also practiced law throughout his life. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and your involvement within the cattle industry?
I have an undergrad degree in agricultural economics at University of Wyoming. Went to college, law school at the University of Wyoming. Started practicing law in about 1985. I've held a number of elected positions. I've been a county attorney, a county commissioner, and also a county coroner. I served on the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission for 6 years. And so I'm just coming to the end of my second term as county commissioner, and I elected not to run again. But I also practiced law until a few years ago when I mostly just quit answering the phone. In 1990, I married my wife in 1985, and she's a fourth or fifth generation on her family ranch. And so she's actively ranched since childhood. And in about 1992, I bought a ranch that we now have. We've merged those two ranches. And they're a cow-calf operation that runs across the state line into South Dakota. And we run on federal and state, and we run on BLM, Forest Service, state leases, private leases, and quite a bit of deeded property. So I've been actively ranching since 1985, and I've owned my own place since 1992.
What do you feel are the major issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets today?
You know, the biggest one is the dominant market position that the packers have, the market concentration that the packers are able to enjoy. And that just almost all the problems stem from that. Because if you had another alternative for your cattle, then they wouldn't be in a position to oppress producers and depress the prices. What should be is that there's about 23 or 4 major packing plants, and they each have about 5% of the market in the United States. And there shouldn't be any more than 5% in one company. And if it was broke up like that, then they would actually compete for the cattle, and you'd be able to get a fair price. But, every indication is that they collude on prices and other marketing methods. Market concentration is the biggest issue, and everything else sort of stems from that. Let me just give you this example. It doesn't relate to cattle, but Harvey Weinstein, he's in Hollywood, and all of these starlets go see Harvey Weinstein, and they know what they're in for when they get there, and yet they do it. And so you could have this little argument in your head about whether or not that's fair or just, because they sort of ask for it, and that's what, they're willing participants. But when you think about it, the real answer is, why should they have to put up with that just to pursue their locations? And the answer is because of market concentration. And he has such a dominant share of the market or had, I don't know what his current situation is, but he was in such a dominant market position that they had really no alternative other than to do whatever he wanted them to do in order for them to succeed. There are lots of industries like that now where the market concentration is just held in just very few hands, and they start being able to dictate in terms of production. In short, market concentration is the real problem, and all the other issues are symptomatic of that.
What solutions do you think could be implemented to solve this issue of market concentration?
In the short term and in a piecemeal fashion, mandatory country of origin labeling would at least give producers an opportunity to compete. And if packers had to label the product that it came from America or not, then you at least would be able to compete at the marketplace, at the supermarket, with, for instance, Brazilian beef. I think that the data indicated strongly that when there was mandatory country of origin labeling, American producers got a lot better price. So that's one thing that can happen. And the other thing, obviously, is just the flip side of your first question, which is, the antitrust laws should be enforced so that they don't have such a dominant market position. And if the packers were broken up like they were when Teddy Roosevelt was president, that would be the main thing that you could do.
Why do you think the antitrust laws haven't been enforced through the years?
I think one of the reasons is that the companies that they are the obvious violators are so big and powerful. The last time anybody took a run at them, it was Microsoft. And of course, they've got lawyers, to tell hell won't have it. There's the smartest lawyers, best lawyers, most lawyers then they can really bottle up the federal government in that litigation. The other thing is that I think it's sort of distorted, but somehow it has become a conservative issue that government shouldn't interfere with private industry when they like trying to regulate how big the industry can get. And there's this, plausibility in the argument that what are you going to do, punish the success of Bill Gates or of these meat packers who have successfully wormed their way to the top of the heap? What are you going to do, just punish them for that? And that logic is all upside down to me. Bill Gates and the fact that in the meatpacking business, the fact that customers can go in and buy meat so cheaply is a very attractive option for consumers. And so politically, there just isn't the support for antitrust regulation like there ought to be. Now, I don't think that most consumers understand all the aspects of what antitrust does to them. And if they did, I think they'd hold a different attitude. But I think that there's a large number of people who are easily duped, and they don't see the dark side of it, and they see themselves as beneficiaries of the success of an entrepreneur like Bill Gates or like Don Tyson.
You recently gave a presentation regarding the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef at the RCAF convention. Can you elaborate on what GRSB really is?
Well, GRSB is it's a 501c3 corporation organized under the laws of the state of Colorado. And it has members just like any other corporation. The members are the biggest players in the beef business for the most part. And although the membership changes over time, the important players in the GRSB were and are Walmart, Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, National Beef, which is now Marfrig, and other meat packers globally, and most of the major pharmaceutical companies, and the non-governmental organizations like the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy and the United Nations. Just almost no producers are involved. And then you have an organization, the NCBA is an organization that pretends to be producers, and they're labeled as producers. But they are not really. That's just, they have the hat. They don't have the cattle. And so their involvement in the NCBA puts the cattleman's face on it, so it appears to anyone who might look into it casually that the NCBA, that cattlemen are actually supportive of the whole GRSB framework, when in fact almost no cattlemen are involved.
What are the goals of this organization?
The goals are actually to reduce demand for beef and to increase costs of beef production, so that eventually people quit eating meat, and specifically they quit eating beef. And the packers that are involved in it, mostly in the big retail outfits, don't have any particular allegiance to beef. The packers and the pharmaceutical companies and all the major corporations are integrated clear across the protein complex. So they also process chicken and pork and soybeans and alternative lab-grown meats and meat substitutes and meat simulators like the Impossible Burger. So they don't really care if they sell beef, and there's pressure on them from further up the food chain to transition away from beef to proteins that they view as more efficient and with a better profit margin. So what they're really trying to do is put beef producers out of business.
How will they go about doing that?
Well, one of the things they're doing is they're insidious way not advertising the positive aspects of beef. They're making consumers believe that it's harmful to the environment and that it's bad for their health. And the other thing that they're doing is that they're moving into a position where they can control the means of production. That is to say, what they want to do is they want to force producers to install RFID ear tags on all their cattle, and then to register those cattle to a specific premise, or call it their ranch, or the place of lease ground, but associate the ear tag numbers with specific real estate. And then they're going to require that the cattle producers abide by certain terms and conditions that they demand. And then the producer needs to hire a third-party contractor to go out. The third-party contractor will take the checklist of requirements from the package and go out to the ranches, and they'll give that checklist to a third-party contractor who's a verifier, who's in the business of verifying meat packers' terms and conditions. They'll take that checklist out to the ranch and make sure that the rancher is in compliance with those meat packers' demands. And then If they are in compliance, then the rancher gets a certification that will allow his ear tag number to be placed into the computer and make that particular animal marketable. But if the producer does not meet the terms and conditions, he does not receive a certification and his product is banned from the market. In doing this, what the packers are shrewd, because if their demands are not too burdensome, not too onerous on the front end, they're just really a requirement of doing what the rancher is already doing. But the guiding principle of the GRSB is what they call continuous improvement, which means that ever tighter terms and conditions that will increase operating costs and decrease flexibility on any given ranch, to the point where producers won't be able to produce for what the meat packers are going to pay them. And because they're in such a dominant position, they can depress the prices. The packers can depress the prices and decide what they're going to pay the producer. That's already what's happened to the chicken business and to the pork business, and this is the way that they're going to do it to the beef business.
In your opinion, what kind of timeline are we looking at for this happening to the cattle industry, and what needs to happen for us to avoid this situation?
They promised when they got started on this in 2012 that they would be purchasing. McDonald's promised that they would be purchasing what they call sustainable beef in 2016, and they made that timeline. Then they would be purchasing substantial quantities of what they call sustainable beef in 2020, which is this year, and that's on track. And I believe that what they intend to do is be fully vertically integrated by 2030.
As an industry, what do we need to do to avoid vertical integration?
Well, it all goes back to the market concentration. And vertical integration isn't something just that you just flip a switch and one day you're vertically integrated. It takes place gradually. And over time, the vertical integration just works its way into position by having a choke point in the supply chain somewhere. And right now, the choke point is at the packer level, where there are only 4 packers that process 85% of the cattle. And so they are in a position to dictate the terms and conditions not only to the producers, but also to the retail people. That what you call a seller. I don't know how interesting this is, but there's a monopoly and there's a monopsony. A monopoly is just having one seller in the market. A monopsony is only having one buyer. Then you have an oligopsonist and an oligopolist. So those are if you only have a handful, a small number of buyers or sellers. So they're in that position right now. But Walmart, of course, is building their own independent supply chain from producers on up, and they are building their own processing plants. And so they see the threat that the packers are making to Walmart. Walmart sees the peril, and so they're going about building their own supply chain.
What are your thoughts on imports of cattle and beef?
Just generally, I don't like it. We produce just about what we consume, and every year we may export a little bit more than we produce, and some years we import more than we export, and some years we export more than we import, but it's all very, very close to even. The answer is we don't need imports. The packers like to have imports because they can bring in cheap meat from Brazil, and they're able to produce it much cheaper in South America and Australia and other parts of the world. They're able to produce it much cheaper than we can produce it here in this country. And they can bring it in, then they get to label it because the USDA has no labeling requirements. They can label it actually product of the USA if they take it out of this box and put it into that box. It's been processed, and so they can label it product of the USA, which is a terrible fraud on the consumer. That's terribly unfair to the American beef producers. But, you can go to the store and find out where your T-shirt and your pair of socks and your fan belt and everything else, you can find out where that's made. But by deliberate actions of the USDA and who get lobbied heavily by the packers, they've avoided having to label beef. So I don't like imports because nobody knows that they are imports. I don't like imports because we don't need imports, and I don't like imports because they're importing beef from parts of the world where there are disease issues and that are transmissible in the chilled meat that comes into the country. So specifically, I'm talking about foot and mouth disease. And when you can tell that the USDA knows that they're going to have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the United States because they've started promoting vaccines for or foot and mouth disease, which is a response to a situation rather than preventing the situation in the first place. So they're bringing that beef in now from regions of Brazil and Uruguay, and it's going to get here. And they're just, there's a new petition out to allow Zoetis to bring viruses onto the continental United States to do vaccine research. So it's inevitable. And it's terribly unfair to the American producers that, for one, because when that gets in the cattle herd or they get to the hog population, the way that historically mitigation has taken place is that they've had to depopulate those herds. It's also terribly unfair to the consumers who are not apprised of the fact that they're being fed beef that may very well be imported from Brazil and may very well contain a foot and mouth virus.
There's currently a petition circulating to bring about a referendum with our beef checkoff program. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the beef checkoff ought to be voted on again. What's happened as a practical matter is that the NCBA controls almost the vast majority of the beef checkoff dollars, which can be tens of millions of dollars. And because the NCBA has a dual loyalty to meat packers and to producers, because the packers are in a much more dominant position, have essentially hijacked the beef checkoff. And I think it needs to be put to the people, the producers, and they need to be informed on what's going on with their beef checkoff. And I really believe that if they were informed and voted on whether or not they thought that was good value, that their $1 head was good value, then they would support it, and otherwise they won't. One common sense reform to me would be that if you were a producer and you thought that the dollar was good for promoting beef, that you got to choose which organization was the recipient of your particular dollars. And that would bring, essentially, they could vote on what sort of job different organizations were doing in terms of their advocacy for the beef business. And whereas the NCBA thinks it's okay to promote any kind of beef, no matter where it's from, RCAF, for example, promotes beef that's grown in the United States. And I believe if people had the choice of giving their checkoff dollar to RCAF or to the NCBA, that the NCBA would fail miserably because they wouldn't be able to support themselves on membership dollars. The only reason they're able to get by with what they do is because they have such a toehold with the beef checkoff.
What are your thoughts on the current DOJ investigation into our 4 big beef packers?
Well, I think about it just kind of like I do their investigation into Hillary Clinton and whether or not it was a crime for her to destroy emails. I think the Department of Justice is a protection racket for major players in lots of different areas of our government. And I think that I think what's going to happen is the Department of Justice is going to be lobbied heavily by major meat packers. And I think they're going to say, there's just no problem here whatsoever. I think that's how it's going to turn out. Department of Justice is going to whitewash the whole thing. They may offer a few observations, but they're not going to do anything substantial. Our only hope in that regard is the lawsuit that's filed privately against the meat packers by RCAF and a number of plaintiffs.
If you could sum it up into one sentence, what does the cattle industry need most today?
It needs to break up the packers.
Do you have any closing statements you'd like to make regarding the cattle markets?
I'm not an expert in cattle markets. It's just not what I spend my time thinking about. I think that the biggest single existential threat to the cattle business right now actually is foot and mouth, because the aggressive manner that the USDA is pursuing imports. And are you familiar, Mackenzie, with the Plum Island Research Center?
I sure am.
Yeah, they're closing that down. That's worse than the 20s in keeping the virus off it. And now they're going to move it right to Tornado Alley. It is just absurd, right in the middle of the biggest hog and cattle population in the country. And you can see this virus in Wuhan, China, that escaped either intentionally or unintentionally from a laboratory in Wuhan, and what that did to the global population and the mess that caused. There's a really great report out that the government did, and I can't tell you which branch of the government. They rated over the life of the facility in Manhattan, Kansas that they're building. There's a real high probability that the virus will escape eventually. So what sense does that make? It makes no sense whatsoever. And if that got in the herds, what you would find is there would be a call to depopulate populations. Producers may or may not be compensated for their losses. It would just be devastating. And I just don't see how that doesn't happen on the trajectory that we're on.
What is their reasoning to move it to Manhattan?
Because Pat Roberts is a senator from Kansas, and he has a lot of power. And so he got Congress to appropriate well over $1 billion to build that laboratory in Manhattan, Kansas. And their excuse is that, it's really hard to get back and forth to Plum Island. It's on that island, and you got to get on a boat, and you got to go over there. And the facility's, aging, so they're got to build it somewhere. Why, let's build it in Manhattan. The real answer, the true answer is because Pat Roberts had such a powerful position on the Senate Ag Committee.
Can you elaborate further on your concern regarding foot and mouth disease making its way into our U.S. cattle herd?
It's everywhere in the world except for here. And you would think that you would look around and go, why do you suppose we didn't get it? How did we escape that? And you go, well, we do all our research offshore, for one thing. We've aggressively banned meat products from countries where it comes from, but now we're importing specifically from those countries. It's endemic in their population. They have no way to purge their livestock of the disease. And it's transmissible in that chilled meat. And then once it gets here, there's 50 different ways you can move it around. So there's the threat of it escaping from the laboratory, and then there's just the other threat. Those meat packers inhale it, and they go exhale it. I'm not an expert about all those vectors, but, I understand there's many, many vectors for spreading that virus. And so, how is it not going to get in the population? You would have to expect that it would. Well, the way they used to do it, last time they had an outbreak like in Britain, they drew like a 7-mile circle around the outbreak and just burned it down. I don't see them doing that here. What I see instead happening is that the virus just gets loose and goes all through the population, and then the United States meat products from that day forward will be undifferentiated. You could just commingle our meat with anybody else's. It's not going to be any different.